Hey, what's up? It's Phoenix, and welcome back to my Mind and Art series, where I talk about individuals throughout history who have struggled with their mental health or mental illness, and have nonetheless created expressive and creative works, as well as creative expressions throughout their writing and their art, and have therefore been able to bring together the struggle with mental illness towards not even just mental illness itself, but also towards creativity and understanding the mind even more. And I think that that is a very exciting place to dive in. Now, I recently read a book called An Unquiet Mind, which is subtitled A Memoir of Moods and Madness, which is also by an individual named Kay Redfield Jamison. And I think Jamison is an interesting writer because of how she is able to capture her analytic and objective perspective from her studies as a clinician, as a doctor, as a psychiatrist and teacher and professor, who not only lectured on these topics of mental illness, specifically with bipolar, but also has lived as a bipolar individual. And so the reason why I chose this book and individual for my Mind and Art series is because I love the way that she has this deep background in mental illness, looking at it from a clinical, detached perspective, while also living it out as someone who has struggled with bipolar. And I really like that juxtaposition because it is kind of an unexpected one. Usually you either have one element or the other, where you might not have experience with the disease, but you still have experience as a clinician, or it might be the opposite, where you have no technical or formal training into understanding these things, but also have struggled with the mental illness yourself. And so I think it's definitely an interesting place to dive into, and I'm super excited to be able to discuss it. Now, Jamison is an interesting individual because she very much struggled with bipolar throughout her life and has gained a lot of insight because of her experiences. And I love that idea that she is able to look at an illness as an objective clinical thing while also looking at it from her own experiences. And there's definitely a lot to dive into. Now, one thing that I think that is important to know about her background is that she very much has struggled to live in a world with stigma and with social shame, and with her kind of competitive nature and the competitive nature of a clinical setting and in universities, where she definitely has struggled with that side of things, but has nonetheless been able to make something out of that through her experiences by also having that lived experience of bipolar. And so the reason why I think this is important is because in An Unquiet Mind, she talks a lot about how there is a kind of brooding, melancholic tradition of many writers who have struggled with mental illness or have had this kind of brooding nature where they look at the world in a more pessimistic way. And this could include a lot of writers. And she actually references writers specifically, such as Byron, such as Melville, such as Hardy, Thomas Hardy, and also Hermann Hesse. And it's interesting how she talks about these writers who have struggled in their worldview throughout their writings to be able to capture this kind of bleak existence that we live in. But I love how she's able to describe in her own tradition of her own writing as being part of this tradition, because she captures some of these really deep, brooding, pessimistic elements that might come from a certain worldview or from the way in which her mind operates, but while also recognizing that there is a depth there that people might take for granted. And so I think it's super powerful to think about. Now, I would say that she is definitely an interesting writer, and I love that she has this literary flourish while also having the analytical side. So she definitely has the artistic, creative side, while also talking about the logical and even philosophical, but definitely clinical elements of this struggle with mental illness. And I love how she's able to bridge that gap and bring together both worlds. Because it is interesting to think of her own internal chaos from struggling with the mental health stuff and juxtaposing that with her actual clinical analytic experience where she did detach from that perspective because she was trying to understand it from a scientific point of view. And I think that that's super interesting. Now, I think that the reality of mental illness can be super tough to live with because it's definitely not easy to comprehend or to figure out what to do. But I love how she's able to use language and knowledge and ideas and writing as a way to find freedom and liberation from the constraints and the imprisonment of mental illness. And while she does talk about mental illness from the positive side of what can be gained and what can be learned from one's experiences, she also has this perspective where she also is thinking about how the reality of mental illness can be super tough to try to grasp, and that you can have this kind of artistic liberation through your words and through understanding what you're writing. And that actually feels very applicable to my own perspective, where I treat my writing and I treat my words and I treat my poetry and philosophy and stories as a way of escaping my own realm of mental illness, to be able to understand the world on a deeper level and to be able to have a little bit of that escapism. And I feel like she captures that perfectly by her own book and by her own writings and by what she's trying to express in her own ideas, and how it does bridge the gap between the analytic objective side that you hope to have in a clinical setting versus the chaotic, irrational, but also more impulsive and creative side of it, and how this is often the tension between what artists experience to be able to bridge the gap. And I think that it can definitely be a big struggle to be able to balance that perspective, to balance both opposing perspectives, but I think it's super interesting to think about. And I just love that this wonderful, magnificent human being is able to use her creativity and her writing and her ideas as a way of bridging that gap and being able to escape and express herself and being able to do that in a way that I think is very profound. Now, I think there are definitely many things that one could describe when talking about this book, some of which I have already described, but I think there's one thing that I wanted to highlight because I think it's really interesting here, that when we think of language, we don't realize how much language is both structured and analytic, but also completely subjective and personal. And so she talks about how language, with talking about mental health, can be very stigmatizing. And so even though a lot of the precise terms that are being used in a clinical setting might serve some kind of function in that setting towards getting closer to the truth and being able to diagnose people, she also talks about how it's extremely difficult to use that language in other contexts because it can feel so demeaning and stigmatizing. And with language always changing and the words that we're always using changing, it can have a completely different impact than how it was traditionally meant. And I wanted to say this because she's very conscious of language. Being an artist, being a writer, being someone who likes words and reads stories and poems and really taps into this philosophical realm. It definitely seems to me that she definitely has struggled to try to figure out what is the best way of conveying something. And so I wanted to highlight this because I think it's incredibly valuable to think about how effective language is at communicating things, and also how ineffective when we use it in a way that is very limiting and constraining. And so this is the other component that I took away from this book, which is that her use of language with talking about her disease has also been something that has helped her understand her situation. And even though it has the logical analytic side that I've talked about, which isn't just the language, but also the ideas and the studies and the clinical detachment, it also does include the words themselves and the artistic element of words and the way in which we put words together. And like I said, I love that she bridges that gap between the two because I think it's incredibly effective, but I also love that she's able to convey how powerful language actually is whenever we're communicating something, and especially how powerful it is when trying to fight stigma and when trying to understand what's really going on in our minds and not speak about ourselves in negative ways and not contribute to that stigma. And so I think this is why it's interesting to have an artist talking about language, not just a clinician or a logical person, but also someone who's looking at it from that creative, expressive perspective, that artistic perspective, where they're trying to capture something that doesn't fit in immediate terms, something that goes outside of our normal experience with words and experience in general. And I love that she does that because it makes me think a little bit more critically about how I talk about myself, how I use words, how I express things, especially when I'm talking about mental illness, and not even just mental illness in general, but also my mental illness. And I love that she was very specific about that in her writing, and that it definitely is evoked in what she expresses. Now, I do also want to express something that I've been thinking about a lot lately. Sometimes it's called neurodivergence. But the idea that I think about, often from my multiplicity of views perspective, where there are often a multiplicity of views that constantly proliferate and that help us understand the world in a deeper way by having different perspectives, such as with the dialectic. But I also think about from the perspective of different minds. So different minds think differently. So Jamison's mind operates in a specific way that might be different from someone who is a little bit more clinical and detached and doesn't have any neurodivergence. And the reason why I think that's so incredibly interesting to me as a writer, and to me as someone that's analyzing the mind, and analyzing art, and analyzing my experiences, is with thinking about how people think differently. So Jamison thinks differently. I think differently. Someone with a different mental condition might think differently. Someone with neurodivergence might think differently. And the reason why I think this is important is I think because it's easy to gloss over the fact that we have different ways of looking at the world. And not even just ways of looking at the world, but also different ways of thinking, being, and experiencing. And I wanted to highlight that here as well, because I think it's important to think about how there's so much that goes into the way that we perceive the world. There's so much that goes into the way that we think about the world. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind, that different minds think differently in different ways. And I really try to understand this in my life. Not just at my work even, though that's important because I'm dealing with people who have struggled with addiction and mental illness, and I'm trying to bridge that gap to be able to relate to them and to be able to work with them in a positive way, but also in general. The world is cosmopolitan in a lot of ways, and it's intellectually and philosophically cosmopolitan. And it's cosmopolitan in terms of our own subjective experiences. And so I'm not arguing for a subjectivism, and I don't think she's arguing for that either. Jamison is. But I think what she is trying to do is convey the idea that our minds are different. That there is, for lack of a better word, neurodivergency. We do diverge in a variety of ways because of the way in which our literal brains perceive the world and the way in which they process things. And I think this is a powerful argument for those struggling with mental illness to recognize that their perspective is valid. Maybe their perspective doesn't seem to be so because it doesn't fit the typical norm. It doesn't fit the kind of average or baseline in which we're expected to function and think. But I think it's important because we know this. People with autism think differently. People with dissociative identity disorder. People that are experiencing things in terms of schizophrenia or bipolar. Whatever it is, whether it's ADHD or something else, they're definitely processing the world in a different way. And I wanted to highlight that because I think it's important here, and I think that this is what Jamison's helping describe, is through her own subjective experience, she recognizes that people think differently. That people think differently and apart from each other in a lot of ways. And that doesn't have to be scary or bad. It's just recognizing that people have different minds, they have different brains, they have different experiences because of the chemicals in their brains. And I just think it's super important to keep in mind that that is what happens. Now the last thing that I want to convey in this episode of my Mind and Art series with talking about this wonderful book, An Unquiet Mind by Jamison, where I just think about how it seems to me that medication is misunderstood. I like Jamison's approach, however, because she looks at it from both a clinician and someone who experienced the side effects and actual impact of medication. So she acknowledges that she was really struggling without the medication, but she also realized that she lost her critical faculties when she was on the medication for too long. And so I like that she breaks down the stigma of medication while also acknowledging its limitation, while also acknowledging that it is the medications that have literally helped her survive. And I love that idea because I think it's incredibly important here to recognize that meds can be very helpful. And I wouldn't prescribe medications. I'm not a doctor. I wouldn't even tell people to take medications unless they thought that it was helpful and they consulted with physicians and psychiatrists and were able to make that decision for themselves. But I think about my life. Maybe I am dependent on medications if you have kind of a cynical view of what medications are, but I also have to acknowledge they've helped me. But I have to tweak them because they're not always helpful because of the side effects. But medications can still be life-affirming. And I love that Jamison is able to acknowledge that the medications did help her. She was able to eventually get to a better place when she realized the ways in which they weren't helping her and the way that she could taper off or at least minimize how much she was taking. But while, like I said, while also realizing that they helped her to literally survive. That without the medication, she might not have survived. And I think that that's what's important here, is to recognize that she's trying to look at it from a clinical perspective. What can help this patient or this client to not feel so much pain? And so she breaks down the stigma of medication to be able to help talk about that and just recognize that it's like any other disease. That you take the medication so it can help you live, that it can help you function. Because the thing that she describes often about her bipolar is how chaotic it made her life to have this mental illness without it being contained. And how she definitely had early judgments at the beginning of people suffering with mental illness and people that were taking medication because she thought that she was above it. But she was able to come to terms with her illness and decide what she needed to do to help her illness. And I think that that is what's so incredible about her story, which is she was able to find out what worked. Writing kept her alive. Love and family kept her alive. Her hope kept her alive. Her creativity, her desire to know, her clinical perspective and clinical detachment, her philosophical mind, her artistic mind, and honestly her capacity for language. And I just think this is what's so powerful to keep in mind, is just that these faculties that we have can help us through some of the most difficult periods of our lives. I just love that she conveys it in that way. Super artistic, super incredible, super creative, and very inspiring. So yeah, I'm Phoenix. I hope that you enjoyed this episode in my Mind and Art series, and I hope that you find it helpful for your own journey with thinking about the mind and thinking about art and thinking about your life. And if you've ever struggled with some of the things that I've talked about in my Mind and Art series, I hope that it's very much relatable. I certainly encourage you to check out the other episodes in my Mind and Art series because I think you'll enjoy them. And I also encourage you to check out my books and the other videos on my channel. I'm Phoenix, and thank you for joining me today, and I will definitely see you next time. I'm Phoenix, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.